They gave her 40 days to build a kitchen out of nothing, though no one said it aloud. Not the rancher who offered the bare frame of a cookhouse still open to the wind, not the woman who took it, and certainly not the man who had thrown her out of his saloon in front of 11 paying customers not 4 hours before. 40 days until the first heifer dropped her calf into the mud of a Montana spring, and everything, the kitchen, the man's grazing outfit, the woman's whole battered notion of her own worth, would either hold or collapse under the weight of that arithmetic. The morning had come in gray and stubborn, the kind of cold that sat in the joints rather than the skin. Snowmelt ran black along the wheel ruts of the trail into town, and smoke from a dozen chimneys bent sideways before it could climb. She had been at the stove of the Silver Elk Saloon since 4 that morning, same as every morning for 6 years, working dough with hands that knew the give of it before her eyes had fully opened. She did not need to measure the salt. She had stopped needing to measure most things around the 3rd year, when her hands had learned enough to argue with any recipe and win. It was the new owner, a man who had bought the saloon on paper and alone and had never once carried a sack of flour himself, who decided, standing in the doorway of his own establishment with a cattle buyer at his elbow, that a woman her size did not belong where customers could see her working. He said it plainly, the way men say things they have rehearsed, to sound like business rather than cruelty. Bad for the atmosphere, he told the room, not to her, about her, while she stood at the pass with a tray of biscuits going cold in her hands. No one at the tables said anything. A few looked at their plates. One man, broad enough to fill a doorway on his own, set down his fork and did not pick it back up. She untied her apron in front of all of them. She did not let her hands shake while she did it, though she would remember later, in the weeks that followed, counting boards and days both, that her hands had wanted to. It was that same broad-shouldered man who found her afterward, out behind the saloon, where the cold air smelled of wood smoke and old grease, and said 9 words to her that she would turn over for years afterward like a coin worn smooth. He had a cookhouse standing half-built on his land, and 40 days before the calves came, and no one to feed the 14 hands who would work through it. He did not say it was charity. She did not ask if it was. The wagon that carried her out of town made no ceremony of it. He had brought a borrowed buckboard with a bad wheel that wanted greasing, and he loaded her trunk himself without asking what was in it, the way a man loads a sack of feed, checking only that the weight sat even. She sat beside him with her hands folded over her apron, still tied fresh though she had nowhere yet to wear it, and watched the saloon's lit windows fall behind them into the dark like something already finished. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The road out of town was rutted with old ice, and the wheels found every seam of it, so that the silence between them had a shape, filled in by creaking wood and the horse's breath fogging white ahead. She counted 40 days in her head before she asked him the number out loud, and when she did, he only nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew rather than asked him a question. 40, he said. Give or take what the weather does to it. She turned that over. Weather did what it wanted on the frontier, and everyone who lived by it learned early not to argue with a number that wasn't really a number at all, but a hope dressed as one. Still, she held on to it. 40 days was a shape she could work inside of. It was smaller than a year, smaller than the 6 years she'd spent making cornbread in a kitchen that was never going to be hers, no matter how long she stood in it. The land changed as they went, town giving way to scrubland to the long dark shoulders of hills she could only guess at by the way the stars disappeared behind them. The cold came down harder once they'd left the buildings, and their windbreaks behind, a dry cold that got into the seams of her coat and found the skin of her wrists. She did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaint bought nothing on a night like this except the attention of a man who might decide, halfway there, that the trouble of a woman her size wasn't worth the mile still ahead. But he didn't look at her that way. He looked at the road, and once, briefly, at the sky, gauging something, weather, maybe, or the hour, and said nothing more until the shape of a barn rose black against the horizon, and beyond it, smaller, half-finished, a structure with no door yet hung, and a roofline that stopped short on one side like a sentence someone had abandoned partway through. "That's it," he said. She looked at the gap where the door should be, and the 40 days sitting inside her chest like a held breath, and did not yet know how to answer him. The wagon rolled to a stop, and the horses stamped once, twice, breath rising off them like smoke off a doused fire. He climbed down first and did not offer his hand to help her, which she understood, after a moment, not as a slight, but as a kindness. He had guessed, correctly, that she would rather manage the step herself than have a man's grip on her arm in the dark, deciding for the both of them what she could and could not do. She climbed down. Her boots found the frozen ground, and the cold came up through the soles of them at once, sharp as a struck match. He walked ahead of her toward the structure, carrying a lantern he had not lit, and it was only when they stood before the black gap of the doorway that he took out a match and struck it against the wall, and the small flame caught the wick, and the light spread just far enough to show her 4 walls, a dirt floor swept clean of debris but not level, a hearth of raw fieldstones stacked but not yet mortared, and a roof that held over half the room and gave way to open sky over the other half, where she could see, framed by the broken edge of the rafters, a handful of hard white stars. She counted the stars without meaning to. She had done that as a girl, on a porch in another state, in a life that belonged to a different woman. "Roof needs finishing," he said. "Hearth needs mortar. Doors in the barn needs hanging." He said it the way another man might read a list of chores to a hired hand, without apology and without softening, and she found she was grateful for that too. She had had enough softening in her life, enough people speaking to her as though she were a bruise that might reopen if touched wrong. 40 days, she said. 40 days, he agreed. Calving starts after that. 14 men, eating 3 times a day, and no time for me to be riding into town for a cook once it does. She looked at the gap in the roof, at the stars caught inside it like something spilled and not yet swept up, and thought of the back room of the Silver Elk, the low ceiling black with grease smoke, the customers she had fed for 6 years, who had never once looked past the doorway to see her face. She thought of the crowd's laughter when she was told to leave. She thought of how quickly a room could turn on a person, and how slowly, if ever, it turned back. "I'll need lumber," she said, "and nails, and someone to teach me how to set a hearthstone, because I've never done it, and I won't do it wrong just to save you asking." He looked at her for the first time, straight on, in the lantern light, and something in his face did not soften so much as settle, like a man deciding a thing had already been proven that he had only suspected before. "There's nails in the barn," he said. "Lumber I can get by Thursday." 40 days, he said, and the words dropped into the cold air between them with the weight of a thing already decided. "Calving starts on the far side of it, some years sooner. I can't promise you sooner won't come." She turned the number over in her mind, the way she might turn a coin to check its face was true. 40 days to build a kitchen out of a shell that had housed nothing but wind and the droppings of barn swallows. 40 days to prove, to herself as much as to him, that a woman who had spent 6 years cooking in another man's back room could stand in one of her own and not feel the old shame settle over her shoulders like a borrowed coat. 40 days, she repeated, and it did not sound like a sentence handed down. It sounded like something she might survive. He nodded once, as if her agreement had closed a ledger, and went to the wall where a lantern hung on a bent nail, and lit it, and by its small orange light she saw the room fully for the first time. The dirt floor packed hard by some earlier use she could not guess at, the stone chimney rising crooked but whole on the east wall, the 2 windows without glass, stuffed with rags gone gray and stiff. It was little more than a husk, but a husk could be filled. "There's a well 30 yards out," he said, "though the rope wants replacing, and the hearth sound below the second course, so you won't need to tear it all down. Just build up from where the old man left it." "What old man?" "Trapper. Before my time here. Died in the winter of the hard freeze, they say, though nobody found him till spring." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without reaching for effect, and she understood that this was simply how the man spoke of death and cold and the long silences of a country that did not care who lived in it. She filed the trapper away in her mind, the way she filed away ingredients for later use, a thing that might matter, might not, but was hers now to keep. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly, her boots loud on the packed dirt, counting paces the way she would count out flour by handfuls when there was no scale to be had. 10 by 14, near enough. Room for a table, if the wood could be spared. Room for shelves along the north wall, out of the damp. "I'll start on the roof first," she said. "No sense laying a good floor under an open sky." "Thursday for lumber," he said again, as if repeating it might hasten the day, and then he took up the lantern and held the door, not the door yet, only the gap where one would hang, so that she could pass through ahead of him into the dark, and the cold outside met her like something she had already decided not to fear. The count began that night, though she did not speak it aloud until the second morning, when she stood in the doorless gap with a nub of charcoal from the cold stove, and marked the inside timber with a single stroke. 39 days until the calves came, the rancher had told her, give or take what the weather decided, and weather did not consult a woman with a piece of charcoal. She marked the second stroke below the first the next morning, and by the 5th day the wall carried a small ladder of black lines that meant nothing to anyone who might wander past, but meant everything to her, because a woman who had been told in front of a full saloon that she took up too much room now had a wall that counted the days until the room was entirely hers. The lumber came on Thursday as promised, hauled in on a flatbed by 2 of the ranch hands who did not look at her directly but tipped their hats when she thanked them, which she took as a kind of progress. She sorted the boards herself, running her palm along each length to feel for warp and rot before she let it near the roof, the way she once ran her thumb along the rind of a ham to know if it had turned. Bad wood, like bad meat, told you what it was before you cooked it. She set aside 3 boards that split under a light knock and used the rest, working from a ladder that wobbled on the uneven ground until she wedged a flat stone beneath one leg, and by the 11th stroke on the wall, the roof no longer showed sky. The nights were the hardest arithmetic. 39 had become 28, and 28 would become fewer, and she lay in the small room she'd been given in the bunkhouse annex, doing the sums by candlelight. How many boards left? How many nails? How many hours of daylight before the frost came down hard enough to stop mortar from setting? She had never in her life been given a number of days, and told they were hers, to spend as she saw fit. At the saloon, there had been only the next order, the next complaint, the next humiliation, delivered with a smile, so the other patrons could pretend it was kindness. Here there was a wall with marks on it, and a rancher who came by most evenings, not to check her progress, but simply to stand a while in the doorway with his hat in his hands, watching the shape of the thing rise the way a man watches weather he cannot control, but has decided to trust. On the 14th stroke, she stopped scraping at the old hearthstones and found, beneath a layer of soot and ash gone hard as clay, a second layer of stone, laid by someone else's hands long before hers, and she sat back on her heels in the cold and wondered whose kitchen this had been before it was ever going to be hers. The stones were river rock, rounded and gray, fitted together with a care that surprised her. The mortar between them crumbled to powder, but the pattern still holding, still true after however many winters had pressed down on it. She traced one with her thumb and found a mark scratched into its face, faint, deliberate, not a word, not a letter she recognized, but a shape like a bird with its wings spread flat, the kind of thing a person carves when they mean to say, "I was here," without knowing who would ever read it. She did not ask him about it that evening. She waited until he came, hat in hand, boots crusted with the mud of a day spent doctoring a heifer that had cut her leg on wire, and she showed him the stone by lamplight, her finger hovering over the mark without touching it again, as though touching it twice might wear it away. He crouched. He looked a long while. Rain had started against the canvas stretched over the unfinished roof, a low, steady drum that filled the silence while he thought. "My mother's mother," he said finally, "built the first cabin here, before the house, before any of it." He straightened, joints cracking, and looked around at the walls Ruth had raised with her own hands, at the hearth she had scraped clean, and something in his face shifted, not surprise, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he were seeing two women standing in the same room across 40 years of weather. "She cooked here?" Ruth asked. "For the men clearing the land, before there were 14 hands, before there was a ranch worth the name." He was quiet a moment. "Nobody talks about her much. She died before I was old enough to ask what I should have." Ruth looked down at the stone again, at the small, stubborn mark of a woman who had also stood in a cold room and decided to stay anyway. She thought of the number on her wall, 26 days left, if the weather held, and felt the count settle differently in her chest than it had that morning, less like a debt owed to time, and more like a thread, laid down by someone else's hands, that she was now, without quite meaning to, picking up and carrying forward. "I'll leave the stone as it is," she said. "Build around it." He nodded once, the way he nodded at most things, and did not say that it pleased him, though it was there in the way he stayed another quarter hour past when he usually left, watching the rain find its way in thin lines down the canvas, saying nothing, in no hurry at all to be elsewhere. The rain did not let up by morning. It came instead in a steady gray patience that soaked the canvas dark and turned the dirt floor of the cookhouse to a thin skin of mud she had to lay boards over just to keep her feet dry while she worked. 26 days. She had chalked the number fresh at first light, under the old ones, and stood looking at it the way a woman might look at a debt she had finally decided to stop being afraid of. She spent that day on the hearth. Stone was slow work, and her hands were not made for it. They were made for dough and broth and the particular give of a chicken's joint under a knife. But she had watched enough fires laid badly to know what made a hearth draw well and what made it choke a room with smoke, and she built accordingly. Flat stones at the base, angled just so, a throat narrow enough to pull the flame up hard. She tested it twice, before the mortar was even dry, holding a match to green kindling and watching the smoke climb instead of spreading, and something in her chest unclenched that she had not known was clenched. By afternoon, 3 of the hands had drifted by under the excuse of checking fence they did not need to check, and stood a while in the rain watching her work, before one of them, the boy called Ezra, asked without looking at her directly whether the roof would hold before the calves came. "It'll hold," she said, "if the rain doesn't outlast my patience, which is considerable." He almost smiled. She had learned by now that a near smile from a ranch hand was worth more than a full one from a man who wanted something from you, and she counted it the way she counted the days. The rancher came at dusk, as he did, wet through the shoulders of his coat, and stood at the doorway looking at the finished hearth for longer than the thing warranted. "You'll need dry wood stacked before the ground freezes," he said. "I'll send Ezra with the wagon. I can stack my own wood." "I know you can," he said it plainly, not as a concession, but as a fact already settled between them, and turned to go, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "There's a woman in town, selling glass panes off a wagon that broke an axle outside her father's store. 2 of them, small, but good glass. I could send for them, if you wanted light in here that wasn't just the door." She thought of the gray afternoon light falling weak and thin through canvas, of the months ahead, when the door would need to stay shut against the cold, and of what it might mean to see out from inside a room that was hers. "I'd want them," she said. He nodded, and this time there was something almost like satisfaction in it, quickly folded away, before he stepped back out into the rain and left her standing in the smoke-clean warmth of her first working fire, counting, without meaning to, not the days remaining, but the small good things accumulating inside them. 28 days remained, and the rain that had followed him out the door kept falling through the night, drumming on the new roof with a sound she had not yet stopped noticing. She lay awake listening to it, testing the noise for leaks, the way she had once tested a stew for salt, and found none. That, more than anything he had said about wood or glass, told her the roof would hold. By morning the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to the fence rails and beaded on the backs of the 2 mules grazing near the barn. She rose before the light was fully up, as she always had, and found that the habit of rising for a kitchen that was not yet hers had become, without her deciding it, the habit of rising for one that was. She built the fire smaller this time, more careful with the wood, now that she understood how much of it there was not, and set a pot of beans to soak while she went out to look at the chimney in daylight. It had not cracked in the night's heat and cooling. She touched the mortar near the base, still faintly warm, and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. Ezra came at mid-morning with the wagon, as promised, and 2 other hands she had not yet learned the names of, lean boys with wind-chapped faces who unloaded split wood in silence and stacked it along the north wall, where she pointed. Because a woman who has cooked for men learns quickly how to be obeyed without raising her voice. When the stack was chest-high, Ezra straightened and looked at the cookhouse the way men look at a thing they are deciding whether to trust. "Smells like something in there," he said. "Not smoke, food." "Beans," she said. "You'll eat them at noon if you're still working." He was still working at noon, and so were the other 2, and she fed them at the plank table with tin plates borrowed from the main house, and none of them spoke much, but none of them left hungry either, and one of the wind-chapped boys asked, quietly, without looking at her, whether she might make cornbread again sometime, the way she used to for the Tuesday crew, and she said she might, and did not say that she had already decided to. That evening, alone again, she counted the wood stacked against the wall and multiplied it roughly against the days remaining, the way she had once counted flour sacks against a season of hungry men, and found the sum did not frighten her the way sums once had. She banked the fire, latched the door against a wind that had begun to smell faintly of coming cold, and lay down on the cot with the numbers still moving behind her closed eyes. 28 days, 1 chimney, 2 panes of glass not yet arrived, and a cornbread promise she meant to keep. 28 days arrived gray and stayed gray, the kind of morning that could not decide between rain and something worse, and she woke before the boys did to test the new chimney draw with a fistful of kindling and a held breath. The smoke went up clean. She stood a long moment watching it climb, one hand still pressed flat against the stone she had mortared herself, feeling the faint heat come through, and allowed herself the smallest satisfaction a person could allow without inviting bad luck to notice it. The 2 window panes had not come. She had asked after them twice at the trading post, and twice been told the freight wagon was delayed by high water on the crossing, and both times she had nodded and said nothing, because saying something would not move water. In their place, she had tacked oiled paper over the frames, and the light that came through was the color of weak tea, and it would have to do. She made the cornbread that morning. She measured the cornmeal by feel, the way her hands had always known it without her mind needing to check, and cracked the eggs one-handed against the rim of a bowl that did not yet feel like hers, though her hands had scrubbed it every night for 3 weeks. The batter went into the skillet with a sound like a held breath released, and the smell that rose afterward was not new to that ranch. It had traveled there every Tuesday for 2 years, folded into a basket, carried across a threshold that had never once been hers to walk through as anything but a servant of someone else's kitchen. Now it filled a room with her name nowhere on it yet, but her hands entirely. The boy who had asked for it ate 2 pieces before he said thank you, and said it looking at his plate rather than at her, which she had come to understand was simply how gratitude moved through men raised on this kind of ground, sideways, low to the earth, never straight at the thing it meant. The rancher came in at midday, stamping mud from his boots, and stopped just inside the door the way he always did, as though crossing the threshold too quickly might undo something. He looked at the chimney drawing clean. He looked at the paper in the windows. He did not ask why glass had not come, because he already knew, and asking would only have made her carry the disappointment twice. 28, he said, not a question. 28, she agreed, and set a plate in front of him without being asked. Cornbread and beans both, and he ate standing, the way he did most days, as though sitting down to it might be claiming more comfort than the season allowed him yet. She watched him finish, and gathered his plate, and did not tell him that she had already begun counting the next 28 in her head, dividing them into what still needed doing, before the herds came down heavy and hungry, and demanding more of her than cornbread, needing instead to know that the room could hold both grief and steam rising off a skillet, and go on holding them, one gray morning at a time. The wind that afternoon carried the particular smell of snow not yet fallen, that flat mineral scent that settled into the back of the throat and made the ranch hands work faster at the woodpile, stacking against a storm none of them could see yet, but all of them could feel, coming the way old injuries ache before rain. She had learned to trust that smell as much as any of them. 28 days left, and the sky was already telling her that not all of them would be kind. She spent the afternoon rendering fat, the smell of it thick and close in the unglazed room, and thought about the paper in the windows and how it would hold against wind, but not against the cold that came through wind's absence, the still, deep cold that settled after a blizzard passed and left the air behind it hard as struck iron. Glass would come eventually. The rancher had said so, and she had learned that when he said a thing plainly, without hedging, it was because he had already found a way to make it true, even if the way was not yet visible to her. In the evening, she wrote the number in charcoal on the beam beside the door, the way she had taken to doing each night, a private ledger only she could read, 28 small marks now trailing back to 40, like a rope she was climbing down hand over hand. She did not know, when she started it, whether it was meant to measure how much time remained or how much she had already spent proving something to a room full of men who had not asked to be sold on her. It had become both. She supposed most true accountings were. One of the hands, a boy no older than 17 with a burn scar climbing up one forearm from a branding iron he'd flinched from his first season, lingered by the stove after supper longer than the others, turning his hat in his hands. He did not speak at first. She let the silence sit, the way she had learned to let silences sit around men who were working themselves toward something. "My mother used to make cornbread thin," he said finally, "like a cracker. This is better." It was not much of a compliment, and he seemed embarrassed the moment it left him, ducking his head and going out into the cold too fast, boots loud on the half-finished floor. But she stood a moment with the rag still in her hand and felt something in her chest loosen that she had not known was tight. 28 days. The chimney drew clean, and the paper held, and somewhere out past the dark ridgeline the cattle were already beginning, without knowing it, to labor toward the calving that would test every board she had raised, and every meal she had not yet learned to cook for 14 hungry, unimpressed men waiting to see if she would last. 27 days, and the wind changed direction in the night. She woke to it before dawn, the way she had learned to wake to weather now, some animal sense grown back into her after years of sleeping above a saloon, where the only weather that mattered was whether a man's mood had turned. This wind came from the north and carried something colder underneath it than the cold that had already settled into the ranch's bones, and she lay still in the dark of the cookhouse's back room and counted, out of habit, the boards over her head. 14. She had nailed 12 of them herself. She built up the fire before the men were awake, because a north wind meant the herd would be uneasy, and uneasy men worked better on food that was already hot when they came to it, rather than food they had to wait on. This she had learned in the saloon's kitchen too, though no one there had ever thanked her for the timing of it. She measured flour by feel now, not by the cup, her hands remembering amounts, the way they remembered the weight of a skillet before her mind caught up to the knowing. The rancher came in while she was turning the bacon, stamping snow from boots that had not needed stamping in 3 weeks. He did not say the wind had changed. He did not need to. He stood by the door a moment with his hat still on, looking out at the gray coming up over the ridge, and something in the set of his shoulders told her the labor out past the dark line was closer than either of them had reckoned on. 27 days, she said, not because he had asked, but because she had taken to saying it aloud each morning now, the way another woman might say a prayer. He glanced at her. Might be less. Might be. He did not explain further, and she did not ask him to. She had learned that much about him in the weeks since the fire had gone up cold in this same stove, that he spoke in the fewest words a thing could be said in, and trusted her to fill the rest with sense of her own. It was a trust she had not been given in 6 years behind the saloon's bar, where every silence from a man had meant either contempt or calculation, never simple respect for the space between two people who understood each other. She set his plate down without being asked twice how he wanted it. He ate standing, the way he always did when the weather turned, as though sitting were a luxury the ranch could not yet afford him. When he was done, he set the plate in the basin himself, a small thing, a thing no man at the Silver Elk had ever once thought to do, and went back out into the wind to see how many of the cows had begun, in the night, to lower their heads and turn inward toward whatever came next. 26 days remained by her own count, a number she kept now the way some women kept scripture, turning it over morning and night, as though the saying of it might slow the ground beneath her feet. She had chalked the tally on the inside of the pantry door, where no one else would think to look, a small ladder of marks climbing toward a date she had fixed in her mind, the way a person fixes the edge of a cliff, not out of fear, but so as not to walk past it blind. Calving season did not wait on any woman's readiness. She had heard him say as much only once, weeks back, in that flat voice that carried no complaint in it, only fact, the way he might have remarked on the direction of the wind. The wind that morning came hard out of the north, carrying with it a cold that got into the mortar between the new stones of the chimney before the mortar had properly set, so that she worked with her hands raw and her breath showing white, even inside the cookhouse walls. She had laid the last of the hearthstones herself 2 days before, hauling them one at a time from the dry creek bed in a sledge she'd built from a broken wagon gate, and now she packed the seams with clay and ash, the way her grandmother had shown her 40 years past in a kitchen that no longer existed on any map. The work steadied her, it always had. There was a mercy in labor that asked nothing of a person but her attention, and gave back, in return, a thing finished, a wall that stood, a fire that drew clean, a loaf that rose in the cold instead of dying in it. She thought sometimes, working, of the 14 men out past the fence line, moving now in a slower rhythm than they had a month ago, watching the herd, the way a man watches a debt come due. She had begun setting food out earlier for them, before first light, because the ones on night watch came in half frozen and would not say so, would only eat standing at the door with their hats still on, in too great a hurry to sit. She had learned their names by their portions before she had learned them by their faces, the tall one from Missouri who took no salt, the boy who could not yet grow a proper beard and ate like he was afraid the food would be taken back. She banked the fire low that evening and stood a moment at the window, watching the shapes of cattle bunch, dark against the paler dark of the pasture, and somewhere out among them a lantern moved, small and steady, held by a hand she had come to know, without needing to see the face above it. 23 days remained, and she had taken to marking them the way she had once marked flour against a lean winter, not on paper, for she owned no calendar worth the name, but with a nail driven into the beam above the stove, one for each day gone, so that the row of iron heads had become its own kind of ledger. She did not tell him she counted. She did not think he needed telling, but she noticed that he had begun to glance at the beam himself, of an evening, when he came in stamping snow from his boots, and did not yet trust his voice enough to speak past the cold in it. The lantern in the pasture had been his, that night and every night since, and she had stopped pretending she did not wait for its movement before she banked the fire. The calving had begun to press harder now. 2 cows lost in as many days, not from carelessness, but from the plain arithmetic of a herd too large and a season too hard, and she saw the toll of it settle into his shoulders, the way frost settles into a fence post, not all at once but by degrees, until the wood remembers nothing but the cold. He ate less, he said less. He came in one night with blood dried black to the elbow and washed at the basin without a word, and she set a plate before him anyway and did not ask, because asking was not a kindness she had been taught, only enduring was, only setting the plate down and staying near enough that a man might speak if speaking was in him. He did not, that night. But he ate the whole of it, and when he rose from the table, he paused at the door with his hand on the frame, and said only, "Roof's holding," which she understood to mean something larger than the roof, and she said, "It is," and let that be the whole of the conversation, because some men's gratitude came in the shape of weather reports, and she had learned to take it as such. She thought, banking the coals low, that a woman could grow accustomed to a silence like his, the way she had grown accustomed to the cold, not warming to it exactly, but learning its edges, learning where it bent and where it did not. 17 more nails to drive, 17 more suppers to set before men who ate standing at the door. She did not know yet what waited on the far side of that last nail, whether it was only a finished cookhouse or something she had not yet let herself name, but she found, wiping down the plank counter in the dark, that she was no longer counting the days out of dread. She was counting them, the way a woman counts toward a thing she wants to arrive. 26 days remained when the wind changed and brought with it the smell of something colder than snow, a flat iron smell that the older hands called the smell before a hard freeze. And she stood in the cookhouse doorway that morning and breathed it in and thought of her grandmother's kitchen in another territory, another decade, where the same smell had once meant slaughtering the last of the chickens before the ground froze too hard to dig. She did not have chickens here. She had 4 sacks of dry beans, a side of bacon going thin, and 14 men who would need more than that when the freeze came and the cattle began to labor. She went to find him in the equipment shed, where he was greasing harness leather with his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, his forearms scarred in a pattern she had stopped trying to read as anything but the record of a life spent close to animals and iron. She told him what the wind meant. He did not look up from the leather. 3 days out, maybe 4, he said. Comes early some years. I'll need more stores before the roads go bad. Take the wagon tomorrow. Take Elias with you. He paused, working the grease into a seam. Get what you need. Don't count coin against it. It was the closest he had come to handing her the whole of his purse, and she understood the weight of that trust even as he said it, without lifting his eyes, the same way he had said, "Roof's holding," offering the largest things sideways, as if looking at them straight might cost him something he could not afford to spend in words. The next morning she rode into the settlement beside a boy of 19 who talked enough for both of them, and she filled the wagon with flour and salt pork and dried apples and a keg of molasses, and she did not go near the saloon, though she felt its presence at the end of the street, the way a person feels a held breath in another room. She heard, from the mercantile clerk, that the new cook there had already quit twice and been rehired twice, that the biscuits had gone hard as creek stones, that men were riding the extra 6 miles to eat at tables they'd once have called beneath them. She said nothing to this news beyond a nod, but she felt something settle in her chest as solid as the sacks she was loading, and on the ride back, with the wagon creaking under its weight, and the boy singing some tuneless trail song into the wind, she counted the days again, 25 now, and found herself doing the arithmetic of the freeze against the arithmetic of the roof, wondering which would finish first, and whether either would matter half so much as what was quietly finishing inside her. The wagon rolled into the yard past dusk, and she found the roof further along than she'd left it. The rancher had spent his own daylight hours up on the beams while she'd been gone, laying shakes in that same wordless way he did everything, as though speech might undo the work of his hands. She stood in the yard with the reins still loose in her fingers, and looked up at what he'd added. A full third more of the roof closed against the sky, the raw wood pale as bone against the weathered boards beneath it. He came down the ladder without hurrying, wiped his palms on his trousers, and took the first sack of flour from her, before she could lift it herself. "Didn't ask you to do that," she said. "Didn't ask," he agreed, and carried the sack inside. She let it be. There was a kind of arithmetic in him too, she was learning, a tallying of what needed doing against what daylight remained, run silently, and settled without conference. She did not think he counted the same days she counted. She thought perhaps he counted the cattle instead, the cows heavy and slow in the near pasture, their bellies swelling toward a reckoning that would not wait on either of their calendars. That night she scalded the molasses into the beans and baked a cornbread thick with the last of the good meal, and the 14 hands ate in near silence, the way men eat when a day has taken more from them than it gave back. She watched them from the doorway between the cookhouse and the raw kitchen, watched the way their shoulders dropped an inch when the food hit the table, and she understood something she hadn't let herself say aloud yet, that this was not so different from the saloon after all, feeding men their strength back so they could go out and spend it again. Only here, no one behind her was ashamed to have her at it. She banked the stove and stepped out into the cold to breathe before sleep. The stars had come out hard and close, the way they did before a freeze, and she could smell winter riding low over the ridgeline, patient, unhurried, in no rush to announce itself before it arrived to take what wasn't finished. 25 days. She turned the number over like a coin worn smooth from handling. The roof was closer now than the loss of it. The calving would come whether the walls were sealed or not, whether the flour held out or not, and she found she had stopped asking which would win, and started asking, instead, what she would have built by the time either one did. Morning came gray and reluctant, the sun a smear behind cloud that would not commit to rain or clear sky either one. She woke before the hands did, as always, and found the water bucket by the door skinned over with a thin sheet of ice she had to crack with her knuckle before she could fill the kettle. 25 days had become 24 sometime in the night, without her marking the exact hour it happened, and she stood a moment in the doorway, watching her own breath hang white in the air, and thinking that this was how time moved out here, not in declarations, but in small thefts, an hour gone here, an inch of daylight gone there, until a man looked up and found the season changed around him. She had the biscuits in the oven, and the salt pork rendering down, when he came in from checking the herd, stamping frost off his boots, his hat brim silvered with it. He did not speak beyond the nod that had become his particular language with her, but he set something on the table near the flour sacks before he shrugged out of his coat, a coil of new rope, still stiff with the tannery smell, and beside it, a paper packet she recognized by its weight before she opened it. Nails. A pound of them, maybe more. The good kind, that didn't bend twice before they held. For the north wall, he said, which was the whole of his explanation, and went to wash at the basin. She turned the packet over in her hand. It was not a gift in the way a saloon man might mean a gift, wrapped in flattery, expecting something returned. It was a plain accounting of what the wall needed and what he had thought to bring, the same as he might note a fence post wanted replacing, and yet she felt the weight of it differently than she let herself show, because a man did not ride to town and back in a morning like this one for nails, unless the wall mattered to him beyond what it sheltered. The hands came in loud and half-frozen an hour later, and she fed them the way she fed them every morning now, without ceremony, without anyone at the table remarking on the size of her hands or the shape of her shadow across the stove. One of the younger ones, a boy no older than 17 with a burn scar climbing his forearm, asked for a second biscuit, and she gave it to him without comment, the way a thing was owed and paid. After they'd gone, she carried the nails out to the north wall herself, hefting the hammer, counting boards left against boards already sealed. 24 days. The wind had shifted since dawn, and it carried, faint but unmistakable now, the mineral smell of coming snow. She worked the north wall until her shoulders burned in the particular way that meant tomorrow she would feel it in her wrists as well, and still she counted boards the way another woman might count coins, because that was what they were to her now, a currency of days that could not be borrowed back once spent. 24. She said it under her breath, the way some women said prayers, not out of piety, but out of the need to hear a thing spoken to believe it was true. The wind kept turning colder through the afternoon, and by the time the light went thin and gray over the ridge, she had sealed 4 more boards than she'd planned, driven by something that was not quite fear, and not quite hope, but sat close to both. He came out near dusk, not to speak but to look, the way he always looked, a long study of the wall, of her hands, of the stacked lumber diminishing against the barn wall, and then he set down a second lantern beside the one she already had burning, so that the light doubled and the shadows she cast grew less lonely for it. He did not say the days were short. He did not need to. The lantern said it for him, the way the nails had that morning, the way his silence had been saying things all along that his mouth seemed unwilling or unable to shape. Snow before Sunday, he said instead, and turned his face toward the ridge where the sky had gone the color of a bruise healing. She looked where he looked. Then I'll have the roof beams up by Friday. He did not argue this. He did not offer help she hadn't asked for, though she saw him measure the remaining work with his eyes, saw some private arithmetic pass behind his face before he let it go. That was his kindness, she had come to understand, not in what he gave, but in what he withheld until she called for it. He turned to go, then stopped, and from his coat pocket drew a folded paper, soft at the creases from having been carried a while. "Buyers coming through next month," he said. "Cattleman out of Cheyenne. Wants to look at stock before the spring drive." He held the paper out, not quite meeting her eyes. Asked where a man could get a decent meal out this far. She took the paper. It was nothing. A name and a date in a stranger's hand. and yet it sat in her palm, with a weight that had nothing to do with its size. "You told him," she said. "Told him there was a cook out here worth the ride." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, as though it were a fact about weather or fence posts, and then he walked back toward the house, leaving her alone with the lanterns and the paper and the wind carrying its mineral warning down from the ridge, 24 days closing to 23 before she'd even finished counting the first. She did not sleep well that night, though the cot in the loft had long since stopped feeling borrowed. She lay with the paper on the crate beside her, and the wind found the gap under the eaves, and worried at it the way it worried at everything unfinished. And she thought about a name in a stranger's hand, and what it meant to be spoken of as a reason to make a ride. 23 days, she rose before the light did, as she always did now, and built the fire in the great iron stove she had scrubbed to black shine with sand and vinegar, until her knuckles cracked, and she set the paper against the wall where she could see it while she worked, a small flag planted in ground she had cleared herself. 14 men ate before the sun cleared the ridge that morning, and she watched them eat the way she had watched them for weeks now. Not for praise, she had stopped waiting for that, but for the plain fact of the thing, plates scraped clean, coffee gone to the last bitter inch, a silence at the table that was not the silence of men enduring a meal, but of men finishing one they had wanted. One of the younger hands, a boy of perhaps 19 with wind-chapped hands and a habit of saying too little, lingered at the door with his hat already on. "Ma'am," he said, "fellow in town was asking after you. At the Mercantile." She did not stop wiping down the long table. "Asking what?" "Asking, was it true? About the cattleman coming. Said folks in town were talking on it." She set the rag down then, because her hands had gone still on their own, the way they sometimes did when something was moving faster than she'd allowed herself to imagine. Folks in town. Talking. She thought of the saloon's back door, the grease-slicked step, the way Whitfield's voice had carried across a room gone quiet, just to make sure everyone heard him call her unfit. She thought of how quickly a town could turn a woman's shame into gossip, and how strange it was, how nearly unbearable, to imagine that same town now turning her name into something else. An errand worth making, a reason to ride out instead of in. She did not say any of this to the boy. She only nodded, and told him to mind the gate was latched, and went back to her work, because the count was the count, regardless of what the town said or didn't. 23 days narrowing toward whatever the 40th would bring, and there was bread proofing under a cloth by the window, and the fire wanted feeding, and somewhere past the ridge, a stranger with a name and a date was already, perhaps, saddling a horse. The stranger came at midday, when the light was flattest and least forgiving, which she would think later was fitting, because there was nothing about him that asked to be softened by shadow. He rode a bay gelding lathered from a hard pace, and he sat it the way men sat horses when they had somewhere to be, and no patience for the getting there. He did not dismount at the gate. He sat looking at the cookhouse, at the new shingles, at the stovepipe she'd set true after 3 tries, at the sign still bare of paint above the door, and something in his face did the arithmetic she had already done 100 times herself. This was not a lean-to. This was not charity. He asked for her by name, and when she came out wiping her hands on her apron, he did not get down from the horse to speak to her, which she noted, and filed away, the way she filed away every small unkindness now, a ledger she kept without meaning to. He said he had come from 3 ranches east, that he bought for a packing outfit out of the territory capital, that he'd heard a woman was feeding calving crews out here on a spread that had no business feeding anyone well, given what he knew of its debts. He said it the way a man states a fact he expects to be corrected on, and when she didn't correct him, his eyes went again to the stovepipe, the shingles, the raw new wood of the porch step. She told him supper was at 6 if he cared to stay and judge for himself. She did not say it kindly. She did not say it unkindly either. She said it the way she now said most things, plain and without asking permission to say them at all. He looked at her a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation she recognized because she had watched it happen before, in the rancher's face the first day, in the boy's, in her own reflections some mornings when she caught it unexpected in a water bucket and did not look away fast enough. He said he'd stay, He did not say thank you. Not yet. She turned back toward the kitchen without waiting to see if he tied his horse, because the bread would not proof itself, and the fire would not feed itself, and there were 17 days left by her count, 17, and a man's opinion of her stove was not going to be what decided how she spent them. The bread, proofed in a bowl, set near the stove's warm belly, and she covered it with a cloth gone soft from years of washing, and she did not think of the man on the horse again, until she heard him ride off toward the north pasture, where the rancher was working a heifer that had gone down twice already that week. 17 days. She said the number to herself, the way she had said it every morning since the count began, not as a prayer, not as a dread, but as a fact to be managed, like flour, like coal, like the particular way the wind came down off the ridge in the late afternoon, and found every gap in the cookhouse walls she had not yet chinked. She worked the dough with the heel of her hand, folding it, turning it, and the rhythm of it steadied her the way it always had, in the saloon kitchen, and before that in a kitchen that belonged to a man whose face she had stopped trying to remember clearly. The 14 hands would come in hungry at 6, and the buyer would come with them or he would not, and either way there would be stew and there would be bread, and there would be the dried apple pie she had been rationing sugar toward for a week, and none of it depended on whether a stranger with clean boots decided her stove was worth trusting. Still, she found herself glancing toward the window more than the bread required. By 4, the light had gone thin and gold, the way it did in early spring, stretching long across the yard, catching the new shingles, and making them look, for a moment, less raw than they were. She heard the boy before she saw him, boots too big for his feet, come to ask, could he carry water for her, same as always? And she said yes, same as always. And he told her the buyer's horse was a fine one, 16 hands if it was an inch. And she said that was a fact, and did not ask more, though she noted it. She set the table herself, 14 places, plain tin, and a 15th she did not announce she was setting until it was already down, worn oilcloth beneath, spoon aligned the way her mother had taught her before her mother had stopped teaching her anything at all. She stood back and looked at it, the long table nearly full, steam already rising from the pot, and thought that whatever the buyer decided tonight, the table would look exactly like this tomorrow, and the day after, for as long as there were days left to count, and after them too. The buyer came at dusk, when the yard had gone the color of old iron, and the smell of wood smoke sat low over the ground, the way it did before a frost. He rode the 16-hand horse the boy had promised, and he dismounted slow, a man used to being watched dismounting, and he looked at the cookhouse the way men looked at things they meant to price. She noted that too, and did not let it move her face. There were 9 days left to count, though she did not say the number aloud to anyone, not even to herself in the way that made it real. She had taken to marking them on the inside of the pantry door with a nail, small strokes low where the shelf hid them, and she touched the newest one now with her thumb before she went out to greet him, a habit worn smooth as a rosary bead. He ate at the long table with the hands, no separate plate, no separate chair, though she watched him note the 15th setting and understood he had done the arithmetic of it before his spoon ever touched the bowl. He said little through the meal. He asked once where the beef had been raised, and was told, plainly, on this ground, by these hands, and he chewed on that along with his supper. After, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the boy had carried the last of the water and gone home to his mother, the rancher and the buyer stood by the corral fence in the dark, 2 shapes against a sky, gone the deep blue-black of a bruise healing, and she cleaned the pots by lantern light, and did not try to hear what passed between them, though the shape of it reached her anyway, the way weather reaches a house before it arrives. She thought of the 9 strokes waiting on the pantry door, and the 31 already made, each one a day she had not been sent away, a day the roof had held, a day the fire had not gone cold before morning. She thought of how a person could count a life that way, in strokes on a door instead of in years, and how it was not a smaller way of counting, only a truer one, closer to the bone of things. The lantern guttered low. She banked the stove for the night, the way she had banked it 31 nights running, and stood a moment in the doorway looking out at the 2 men and the dark shapes of the cattle beyond them, patient, breathing steam into the cold, waiting the way everything on this ground seemed to be waiting, for the count to run its course. She woke before the light did, as she had every one of those 31 mornings, and found the 32nd waiting for her, the way a debt waits, patient and exact. Frost had come hard in the night. It laced the inside of the cookhouse window in ferns of white, and she stood a moment with her palm not quite touching the glass, feeling the cold come through it anyway. A cold with teeth in it. A cold that meant the calves would come now, whether the ground was ready or not. She made the mark on the pantry door before she banked the stove, before she filled the kettle, before anything. 32 strokes. She stepped back and looked at them the way a woman looks at a ledger she has kept herself, knowing every entry, owing no explanation of it to anyone. He came to the cookhouse door before the men did, stamping frost from his boots, and he did not speak of the night before, of the two shapes against the bruised sky, of whatever weather had passed between him and the trail rider, and settled into some decision she had not been told. He set a dead hen on the table instead, its neck already wrung, its feathers still faintly warm, and said only that the hands would want something hot in them before noon, because the first of the heifers had gone down in the north pasture an hour past dark and had not yet delivered. She understood the arithmetic of that without being told. A heifer down that long meant trouble in the birthing, meant men out in the cold with their arms in places arms were not meant to go, meant a day that would not end, when the sun did. She put the coffee on before she plucked the hen. She judged the size of the pot she would need by the sound of his voice, which was flatter than usual, and by the way he did not sit, only stood in the doorway a moment, with his hat still on, looking toward the pasture, as if he could see through the barn wall, and the dark, and the distance to the exact spot where the trouble was. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the hen and the kettle and the frost still furring the glass, and she worked with the particular quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that her part of a hard day was to make sure the men had something to come back to. She did not know yet how many would come back tired, how many would come back grim, whether the heifer or the calf or both would be lost before the sun cleared the ridge. She only knew the count on the door had reached 32, and that whatever this day asked of her, she meant to still be standing at the end of it to make the 33rd mark. The men came back before the sun found the ridge, and she heard them before she saw them, boots dragging, a low exchange of words too tired to carry far. She stepped out onto the porch with the coffee already poured into 2 cups because she had learned, these past weeks, to read the shape of trouble by the pace of a man's walk. The heifer had lived, the calf had not. He told her this, the way he told her everything, plainly, without dressing it in more sorrow than it needed, though she saw the sorrow anyway, in the set of his shoulders, and the way his hands, raw from the work, would not quite hold still around the cup. She did not offer comfort in words. She refilled the cup when it emptied, and put bread in front of him, and let the kitchen do what it had always done, which was to say, without saying, "You are provided for, whatever else has been lost." The other hands ate in shifts through the morning, coming in cold and leaving warm, and she marked each one's face without meaning to, who looked hollowed out, who looked only tired, who had blood still under his nails that he had not thought to wash. She fed them the way she had fed them for 32 days, and if there was less talk than usual, she did not fill the silence with her own. Some griefs wanted company, others wanted only quiet, and food, and the knowledge that tomorrow's work would still need doing. By afternoon the day had settled into something almost ordinary, which she understood now was its own kind of mercy, that a ranch could absorb a loss and keep moving, that the loss did not stop the count. She went out at dusk to the doorframe and made the 33rd mark beside the others, the knife catching last light before she put it away. She stood there longer than she needed to, looking down the row of marks she had cut one by one, and thought of how a person could measure a life this way if they had to, not in what was gained, but in what was simply endured and outlasted. 33 days, 7 left before the count ran out, and whatever came after arrived to find her, whether that was the calving season finished and the cookhouse hers in full, or something else she had not yet let herself imagine. Behind her the house held its lamplight, and the smell of tomorrow's bread, already working in its bowl, and she went back inside to see to it, because the work did not pause for grief, and neither, she had learned, did she. The 7 days that followed moved the way the last miles of a long road move, slower for the wanting of them to be done, and faster for the same reason. Calves came steady now, the worst of it behind them, and the hands who had gone hollow-eyed through the bad stretch began to eat, like men remembering they had bodies to keep. She fed them, she counted. On the 37th day she nailed the last board to the cookhouse wall and stood back and saw that it no longer looked unfinished, only new, which was a different thing entirely. On the 39th she cut the mark into the frame and looked at the row of them, 39 small wounds in old wood, and understood she had run out of days to be afraid in. The 40th morning came with a hard blue sky and no wind at all, as if the season had spent its violence and had nothing left to prove. She rose before light, as she always did, and built the fire, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, there was a plank sign, leaned against the cookhouse porch post, lettered the night before by a hand that was not hers, in paint still faintly tacky at the edges. It bore her name, nothing more. No saloon word above it, no man's name beside it, only the plain fact of who had made the place what it was. The rancher came out while she was reading it, and did not say anything about it, only lifted it and set the nails, because that was how he said the things he meant. The wagon came up the road an hour later. The saloon owner climbed down stiff and overdressed for the country, and he made his offer standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. Double wages, her name back on a menu somewhere it had never truly been, an apology folded so thin inside the money that it did not need saying aloud. She let him finish. She had learned, in 40 days, the value of letting a man finish. Then she told him no, plainly, the way she gave orders in her own kitchen, and turned back toward the porch where the sign hung fresh and level in the morning light. Her name burned pale into new pine, and behind her in the doorway, the rancher stood without a word, watching the wagon turn for the road it had come by. She did not watch it go. She had bread rising, and buyers coming that afternoon who had started choosing this table over any other in the territory, and a house that was hers, in the way a thing becomes yours only after it has cost you something. The counting was done. What remained was simply the living of it, day after